Hello, folks. American Nomad here. Welcome to Living in a U-Haul. Today, the topic mainly will be the insulation and the process of getting this thing warm enough to live in Indiana. I started out letting you know that this was about becoming debt free. And I had purchased, I owned a truck. Which I crashed. And then I bought a van, which had a bad transmission and some other issues. And I knew that I was going to have to buy transportation, regardless of if I decided to move back into an apartment, give this idea up, or whatever I thought I was going to do. Regardless, I was going to need dependable transportation. And so when I looked at the prices of vehicles and stuff, I was seeing what was available and what options I had. And I went to the U-Haul site and discovered that like compared to the same year, make, and model of a van or a truck, the F450 or E450, that actually the U-Hauls were cheaper. And so basically I was able to find a U-Haul that I was interested in, and I had searched a lot. I had searched a whole lot online. I had spent hours and hours researching different vehicles all over 2 or 3 states. And what I came up with finally was there was one in Illinois that I had called and talked to the gentleman on, and it had been on their property pretty much, 8 of the 10 years that its life existed. So I asked a bunch of maintenance questions, and they were a maintenance shop, automotive shop, and they did all the repairs in-house. So while that was a plus because I knew who was working on it and what they had done to it, one of my main issues was no leaks. I absolutely didn't want anything with a leak. The van actually had a leak in it, and it would occasionally, from the center console in the roof, just start from probably a leak in the roof rack. It would wander over on some insulation or whatever and drip down on the center of the van, and that was a big thing that I just didn't want to happen if I was spending more money. Now, this van was listed for $94.95 when I first inquired about it. I found out all the information I wanted to know, and then I decided I was going to make a trip to get it. If it was what I expected when I saw it. Took it for a test drive, really beat the heck out of it actually, and it held up. It seemed to be pretty good shape, pretty good condition on tires, low mileage, had 140,000 miles for a 10-year-old vehicle, and I just thought, well, I knew what I was going to have to do. I was trying to get out of debt, but I knew I was going to need transportation regardless. So I went and got a personal loan for $10,000 because I didn't want to put the title up. So, and that was the most they would give me on a personal signature loan at the time. So I went and I went to look at the van, and I took the cash with me and I purchased it on site. I paid $7,900 for it eventually, was what we worked out. I think under $8,000 for a 10-year-old vehicle with 140,000 miles on it and full maintenance records seemed to be a reasonable deal, since it didn't have any leaks, it didn't have any major damage. There was a little bit of damage on the front, the door area, and a little bit of bumper damage, but that didn't concern me as far as livability or the ability of it to function down the roadway. So I didn't think them were important issues, and I went ahead and purchased the van. So I purchased the van. in November. I had just spent 6 months in the other two vehicles, and I had actually doubled up on my bills. So I was reducing the amount of debt I was in at a rate that I'd never reduced it before, and I wanted to continue. So I did decide that spending $10,000 would be a reasonable choice, and that that again would just be added to my overall debt, and eventually I would get it paid down. But now I knew I was going to have to be longer living in a vehicle, and so that first week I realized the roll-up door wasn't going to work. And as you've seen in a previous episode, if not, please watch it, that I decided to put the door on the back and close up the back so it had a man door, and I could lock it while I was in it and not get locked in it by someone randomly walking past, because that latch on the roll-up door I had no control over from the inside, or I had to leave the door open. I got that done, but I also knew in that first week, because it was cold, and I had my portable buddy heater in the van, I could never turn it on high. It was such a small area that you'd turn it on for a few minutes, you'd warm it up, and I'd turn it off. I didn't even sleep with it on. I had a 0-degree sleeping bag, and I was perfectly comfortable at night, no matter how cold it got. But I could reach over. It was right close to me. I could reach over. I could click it on. I could curl up under the blanket again. And in a few minutes, it was warm, and I could get up, get dressed, and do my business. And basically, the heater was working well. Well, now that I'm in this big box, I cranked that heater on high. Naturally, I had to leave the back door up just a hair. And the heater really just wasn't warming the box up. As much heat as it puts out, it did okay, but it wasn't keeping it warm unless I was right close to it, sitting in front of it. And I knew right away, it's like no insulation. The heat loss was amazing. So it was like, okay, the heat transfer through the aluminum floor and areas, it just wasn't keeping it warm. I knew I was going to have to insulate it. Made that trip to the hardware store to get all the things I needed, the door, the lumber, and whatnot. And I was going to buy blow-in insulation. I had never used it before, so I was talking to one of the agents at the store, and during our conversation, I discussed what I was going to do with it, and he explained that it would off-gas for approximately a week, and I wouldn't be able to stay in it for at least that week. Well, that cut out that idea because, I had nowhere else to stay. I could have stayed at friends or relatives and had it done, and that's what I would recommend to anybody else. If you ever decide to do this, I recommend blow-in insulation and don't stay in it while you're building it. But that was not my position, so I decided to use the styrofoam rigid board insulation, and I thought it'd be a good choice and easy to work with. Now, while I was in that van, I also had purchased a roll of that foil bubble wrap. And I put that bubble wrap over the windows on the van to hide the fact that I was in there with the lights on and stuff, but also that to maintain some heat that was in there. And I noticed when I had the heater on that it would reflect off of some bubble wrap, and I could feel the heat radiating back against my skin. And I thought that was pretty incredible, actually, that 6-8 feet away it would still reflect back that much heat. And I decided that with the aluminum roof on this, that it would be a good idea to put the bubble wrap above the insulation in order to, when I'm in direct sun, to direct that heat back out of the vehicle and not absorb it into the vehicle. So my first thing was 2 inches of insulation in the ceiling with the bubble wrap above it, and then one 3/4 inch insulation on the walls. Fairly basic. I didn't do anything with the floor at that time. When I got all that done, I got back to work, and at the time I had a job that lended me benefits. For example, there was a shower at work, so I didn't really need a shower here in the van. Although it was on the list of things to do, it wasn't a necessary immediate item. Also, I had coolers, and because of the job, I actually got to eat at work. They had a cafeteria at work, so I ate at work every day. And for years, I've had a Carnation Instant breakfast for breakfast since junior high school. I've done that. I don't really eat breakfast, but around noon when I get hungry, they had a cafeteria, and as an employee, I got a really good deal, and I went and I would eat there. And then, so in the evening, I would have a sandwich. What normally people would have for lunch, I was having nice dinners at lunchtime, and then in the evening, I would just have a bologna sandwich or a ham sandwich or something like that. So all I had was a cooler for my beverages and to keep a small amount of food in it. And I got ice out of our ice maker at work. In our break room, we had a giant commercial ice maker. So I was able to take a couple of pounds of ice every day and put in my cooler, drain the water out. And that was a wonderful way to do things. While I was in the van, it worked very nicely. When I got into this truck, I thought that was going to continue that way, and I had gone back after I get the door on it and stuff and returned back to work the following week. And over a couple of months, I could see my job was changing, and they were tearing down buildings where I was working at, actually. And I knew that while it wasn't immediate, there was going to be an effect on my livelihood eventually at this location. And so I was starting to plan for the future. And then I got injured on the job, and I was off for several months. I had to have I tore my bicep tendon, had to have it pulled up and screwed into the bone on the shoulder. I don't recommend that for anybody. If you have to have it, I understand, but I'd recommend you try not to have that injury. Anyway, during that time, I had a lot of time on my hands, and I had income coming in still, and so I was thinking, well, it was time to fix up the interior and make it more comfortable, which I put in a floor, very nice floor, and all I did was put the thin layer, it's maybe a 1/16 of an inch, like a black foam. I actually use some of it to line drawers in my toolbox, that kind of stuff. It goes underneath your floor as an underlayment, and I put that down, and then I put the floor in without any insulation under it. And then I decided I was going to build the bathroom area, and I was going to put a linoleum floor, one-piece linoleum floor that wrapped up the sides of the walls so it would drain down, and when I took a shower in there, all the water would drain to one area, and cut a hole in the floor, put a drain in, and was in process to do that. I was also eventually going to put in the built-in RV style toilet with the holding tanks and everything else, but this was going to be a long process. I was in no hurry. And so I had got the floor in, I'd got the wall in, the one that holds the TV behind me, between me and the bathroom, because I had the portable toilet, and decided that sometimes I left the back door open. I have screen, a bug screen that I put over the door like many people have in their home. So I would leave the door open and enjoy that air, but I, wanted to use the bathroom maybe, and I didn't want people to drive by and see that. So I thought that separating the bathroom area was going to be an eventual thing, and it was a good idea to just get that done. And that's what I did. I worked on that for quite a while and got it fairly nice. And then a few months into, well, actually I was back to work. So it was several months later. I was back to work and I was doing the same kind of routine. And another thing was I had no electric. I had a battery pack jumper pack. And I would use that to play my DVD player and to charge my phone. And I was capable of taking that to work each day and plugging it in and recharging it. So that provided the electric I needed, for a weekend or for overnight, because I didn't use any electric. So once I got the floor in and I was back to work and I had my shower area in, even though I didn't have a shower yet, I had an area where I could heat a pan of water and I could clean myself up and drain in the floor. So I didn't have any holding tanks at the time. But you park over a gravel area or somewhere and, you can get away with that. At some point along the way, I was back to work. I was staying in Walmarts at night a good portion of the time. Other places with this particular truck, and at the time it still didn't have windows in it. I could pull into a parking place in any apartment complex and back in maybe in the evening, and they'd think maybe somebody was moving. I'd get up the next morning and leave, and I wouldn't go back to that apartment. There were plenty of complexes to choose from, so I never had any problems with that. Nobody ever questioned it. And one night, it was rather cool in wintertime, and I woke up and needed to use the bathroom, and I put my foot on the floor, and my foot got wet. And immediately I was like panicked. Is the roof leaking? What's going on? What's happening? And what I had noticed was that somewhere in my travels, the cooler had bumped up against something and it broke off the drain plug. And so all the water from the cooler drained out onto my floor, and it completely ruined the floor. It got underneath the linoleum because it went underneath the floor in this area, which allowed it under the floor in the other area, and got under the linoleum, and it started bubbling up and coming unattached. And I knew at that point, serious problem. And now the way I had done this was I had done the floor, and then I put the ceiling up, and the walls screwed into place. The ceiling and the floor have no screws in them. The walls hold everything in place. And that's still actually the way it is. But everything got changed. I had to now redo everything. And again, I was spending money when I was trying to get out of debt. At that point, though, I got really ticked off about the water thing and realized that just was not a sustainable thing, especially if I no longer had that job because of the cost of the ice and the loss of food. Both of them things combined cost a lot of money. And I decided that this time I was going to insulate a lot better. I was going to put in a better floor, and I was going to buy a 12-volt refrigerator, which I did. And we will cover that refrigerator in a later episode because that turned out to be an issue. But I loved the refrigerator while it worked. I will say that. It was a fantastic refrigerator while it worked. It was a choice. It could have been a freezer if I'd have cranked the temperature down, but I kept mostly pops, beverages, and stuff, and not a lot of food in it because that was my lifestyle. I didn't need a lot of food at that particular moment in the truck. So I set it at 34 degrees, and it stayed there pretty much the whole time I had it. Yeah, occasionally a pop was frozen at 34. There were cold spots. But for the most part, it was a wonderful unit, and it kept everything in good shape as I needed. So I had gone back and purchased. I decided to reinvest, and I purchased a lot more insulation. I purchased a $700 refrigerator, 12 volt. I purchased. Then I realized, I knew right away, well, I'm going to have to run this refrigerator. It's 12 volt, and I knew that I was going to need to be able to run that. And I purchased solar panels and the inverter and the solar charge controller, and started doing it. And it's like, well, okay, I'm going to do this right. I'm going to spend the money this time and go all out on it, because this is getting ridiculous, the having to redo things in stages all the time. So now the first time I did the insulation, naturally there were no leaks in this thing, and I didn't want to take all the bolts out that hold everything together. Removing the inner rails. Now each one of these, where is it? Each one of these is a bolt that goes through that holds the rails on the inside of the truck. And the ones along the top rail up here, they are the ones that hold the roll-up door together, and the mechanism, the railings for that. And when I arrived at my friend's house with the boards of insulation and stuff, he says, well, we got to take all them bolts out and replace them. And I was like, okay, I just spent a bunch of money on something that didn't leak. I certainly wasn't going to start putting holes in it and trying to patch them the first day or the first week. And so I said that was an absolute no. And I ended up leaving them rails and them brackets in there, which was one of my mistakes along the way. Know this stuff if you're going into it, if you're going to do the U-Haul, that each one of them bolts holds them rails in, and if you're going to replace them, you're going to cut them off, you're going to replace it with something else. That's a lot of money in hardware. That would have left hundreds of holes. I would have had to find hundreds of bolts or something to plug all them holes and then seal them so it didn't leak. And I already had a unit that didn't leak, especially on the roof. I really didn't want to take the ones out that up along the edge of the roof where the rail for the door ran, and I didn't have the materials with me to take that out when I went to the friends who said he'd help me. And I realized that, well, then we're going to have to just stay. I was going to have to work around them, which the blow-in insulation would have been ideal for that. But what happened was I had to bow the tops of the walls out just a little to clear them rails. And so I went back, I purchased a lot more insulation, and currently I have 4 inches of insulation in the ceiling, hardboard insulation. I did the whole van, the whole thing is wrapped in the bubble wrap first. Complete envelope, sealed everywhere, taped on all the edges, taped around the windows. I cleaned it all up and got that all in. And the first night, that was the first night of redoing it. And I went in to go to sleep that night. I still had my inflatable mattress, and I turned on my light, and that bubble wrap reflecting back at me. Boy, that gave me a headache really fast. That was a weird thing that happened that I didn't expect. Being in a reflective room is an interesting feeling, I'll tell you. But I had the full wrap, and I decided to go with the 4 inches of insulation on the ceiling. I was going to continue with the 3/4 in the walls, although I could have increased that at the time. But at that point, now I had just installed windows, and that would bring the walls out farther than the edge of the window, and the 3/4 worked out fine. So I thought, well, I'd stick with it. But I also went with 2 inches on the floor, and then 3/4 inch plywood with the marine plywood with a good polyurethane coating, a couple coats on it. Gave me a good stable floor. I really like it a lot better than the other flooring. So there's another mistake that I made that hopefully you can go and just go straight to the correct stuff. That other flooring, it's great in the house, but putting it in somewhere that moves and shifts, and the container changes shape depending on the road or how you're parked, you really don't want to use that interlocking flooring. It just isn't going to hold up well for you over a long period. I ripped out the linoleum out of the bathroom area, and I was trying to decide what to do in there. And basically what I decided to do was, and that was a mistake too, was I poured a concrete floor and had 2/3 of the bathroom shower area in the shower area. In the toilet area, I put 4 inches of insulation, and then vinyled over that, and then to set the toilet on top of. That way it would set at the same height as a house toilet. It was at a comfortable height, which, the small toilet worked when I was in the pickup truck, and my cab, my headspace was very limited, and so that shorter toilet was nice. And naturally, me not wanting to spend money, I'm not going to go buy a different one when I already have one that functions. Whether it was comfortable or not was really beside the point. And that's the way I'm always am. I'm willing to give up some comfort and some conveniences, as long as I have stuff that functions correctly. So I poured the concrete, I put in the insulation, covered it with vinyl, and then I sprayed it with the Flexol seal. Seen it on TV. You can make a boat out of it. Ought to work good for a floor. So I coated the concrete, come up the walls, up the edges of the walls, with 6 inches of the vinyl around all the edges, and then sprayed that insulation up on the edges of the walls. That way, when I put the wallboard down over the top edge of that, it would be, all the water would drip down and be on the inside of that panel. So that's the way I went about doing that. And it actually, people thought I was crazy. The concrete's held up the best of anything in this truck. There are no cracks. I used a high fiber concrete, very high fiber. I was surprised at how much fiber was in it. And it has long strands of fiberglass in it. And I essentially mixed it and poured it in there myself, and then graded it down to the drain from all directions, and it's made a wonderful floor. I did use some caulk to cover some rough areas in the floor area, and as I've come to find out now a couple years later, that seal all does not stick to the caulk. It sticks great to the concrete. It sticks great to the vinyl. It's worked on everything else I've ever used it on, but it did not work on the latex caulk. So there's another thing of interest for somebody. Keep from making that mistake. I wish I hadn't caulked that now to smooth it out. I wish I'd have just left it rough. It wouldn't have been that harsh on the feet. I didn't need to smooth it out the way I did. But I thought that it was going to be rough to stand on, and so therefore I tried to smooth it out with the caulk. That was a bad idea. Don't do that. Now, where we're at is I have a complete bubble wrap envelope, 4 inches of insulation on the ceiling, 3/4 inch plus hardboard on the walls, 2 inches on the floor, and 3/4 inch plywood on top of that. I now have a insulated compartment that it will maintain the heat that I put in it. And I stay very warm, actually, in the winter. Sometimes too warm. Now, we're going to talk in the future about the solar panels, the refrigerator, and the TV, and the 12-volt equipment that I bought along the way, because my original idea was to be all 12 volt and no 120 at all. Just a more efficient, I thought, design. But when we get deeper into the solar and explaining how that works, we'll discuss what I wish I would have done